So what's something that you've waited for a long time, and maybe the pain got really long? I remember as a child, Channel or child this time of year, or we had to wait for presents, and it felt like every other kid in church, they got to open their presents before church on Christmas morning. Not the Staub family. We waited until after church, and then until after lunch after church, and if my mom was on duty at the hospital, like she was every other Sunday, then it was after lunch, and after my mom got home, and after she was rested, and then when she was ready, then we opened presents, and that felt like such a long wait. Sometimes we wait, and it feels like the wait's never going to end, and it's almost like we move on to other things. And I'm sure many of you can share in this little experience. You call a customer service number, and before you get to talk to anybody, you get to listen to some music. And sometimes it feels like the music goes on and on and on, and then so maybe you access your speakerphone feature and you set it down, and then you begin to check emails or put the dishes away or fold some laundry, and then you hear a voice and it startles you, and you have to almost remember, why is this voice speaking? I don't even remember why I called. Oh, that's right, this is why I called. We move on in some ways. And then sometimes we think about, well, what if you were to wait for something that was going to be fundamentally, radically life-altering? How long would you be willing to wait? How long would the wait keep your focus, keep your attention? There's a story in the current issue of Christianity Today about Jean-Pierre Guitera. He was born in Rwanda. The country exploded in civil war in 1994. He finds a refugee camp home in first the Democratic Republic of Congo, then later in Tanzania, then finally in the northwest corner of Kenya. There he meets his wife, and they get married, and they live there for the first 15 years of their marriage. Can you believe that? There they are. And they're waiting for a country to say, well, you can come live here, but they wait. And how long would the wait keep your attention? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years. Does it feel like the wait is ever going to end? Will it ever be over? Will what you're waiting for ever come to be? This is where we find Zechariah. He's waiting. He's waiting. He's waiting for God to make good on his promises. And yet, we get the sense that Zechariah has in some ways maybe moved on. Yeah, he's serving as priest. But we get the sense maybe he's almost going through the motions a little bit more than he is actively expecting God to do something, because we already heard his question. How can I be sure of this? Here's Gabriel coming. Gabriel says to him, you and Elizabeth are going to have a child in your old age. You're going to conceive, and here's going to be the son. His name's going to be John. And well, how can I be sure of this? I mean, this doesn't seem like it could happen. There's nothing rational that would explain this. How could this be? So Gabriel says, and now you will be silent. And he hits the mute button, and there sits Zechariah. And the song that we just read, that we just heard Kevin read, the song is Zechariah's renewed awareness that the waiting does come to an end, that God does indeed act, but it might be a while. You heard the song, you heard the lyric, this one who's to come, the one before whom John would prepare the way, this one, he's the long-awaited, promised one from the line of David. He's going to sit on David's throne. He's going to rule over this kingdom forever. And even before that, there's a promise made to Abraham. And Abraham, through your family, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. But there was kind of a long wait. There were generations that passed between Abraham and David. And then there were generations that passed between David and the announcement that this one would come again through the prophets. And we sang this morning, there was fear. The silent age, 400 years. This is where we find Zechariah. Will there be an end to the waiting? Will God do something? Or do we move on because the wait seems to be so long and so unfulfilled? Maybe this sounds familiar to us in our circumstances. First Sunday evening of Advent, we were here. We were thinking about this topic of waiting. We are people who wait. And we said sometimes we can be distracted from our waiting. And a very simple reason why we can be distracted from our waiting is because a lot of time has passed. We pick up some cues in the New Testament that even after some 20 years, maybe 30, maybe 40, but not very long after Jesus has said, I will come again, and then he ascends. Not very much time passes before the New Testament church begins to get a little bit restless, we sense. Maybe a little skeptical. Jesus said he was going to return, that he's going to come, but it doesn't look like he might after all. That was only 20, 30, 40 years, and here we sit, some 2,000 years almost after the fact. So he said he's coming back. Is he going to come back? Maybe sometimes we find ourselves moving on from the wait because, boy, that's been a long time. Will something new happen? Can something new happen? A devotional I'm using this time of year, the author says this. Hang with me. We'll unpack it a little bit. He says, the present world of modern morality, advanced technology, and uncompromising ideology feels like and claims to be a closed system in which all possibilities for the future are well in hand. Here's what he means. We know the problems that lie before us. Things change, but in some ways, things don't change. There's always a new crisis. There's always a new problem. There's always people that need to be fed. There's people that need a safe place. There's diseases that spread. There's death. What are you going to do about death? And he's saying that we live in a world where it looks to us like the solutions are up to us. If we just figure out the next solution to the problem, then maybe we advance a little bit, but it's up to us. We can figure this out. The system is closed. Everything we need to figure it out, we have before us. Well, here's Scripture's message. One is coming. Jesus. He's going to come again, and when he does, he's going to break into this, what looks to be a closed system, and he's going to open up such new possibilities for life. He's going to fundamentally alter the look of life, the shape of life, the feel of life, because he's going to bring with him this power that renews and transforms. It looks like we live in this closed system. That any possibility for the future is well in hand. In the season of Advent, we tend to this awareness. We're awaiting people. Jesus is going to come again and break in. So the author goes on to say this. Advent is the awareness that this seemingly closed, guaranteed system is rendered penultimate. It's second to last. It's almost final, but not final. It's rendered penultimate by the holy power of God. Oh, this is the way things are now. But in the next phase, this next era, Jesus will break in, and it will be different. And we wait for that. This is Zechariah's song. Zechariah has had 9 months to think about this. 9 months after asking his question and having his wife conceive this child, and then the child is born. Zechariah comes again to the awareness that there's something always afoot in this world, even when we can't see it. And what's afoot is the God who created this world, ever active, ever bringing his promises to their fulfillment, so that in the end, there will be life as we long for it. This is what we remember together. It's not the most obvious thing that we can always see, but God is writing this story in this world. And here's what Zechariah came to realize. At long last, the chapter that Israel had been waiting for to be written, God was finally beginning to write. It would be prepared for through the birth of Zechariah's son, who would prepare the way for Jesus, in whom, Zechariah sings, there will be the forgiveness of sins. And as Jesus unfolds in his ministry, we see there's so much more. There's healing that's granted. The dead are even raised by the power of Jesus. He's raised, and then he ascends, and he's seated at the right hand. And from there he will come again to judge the living and the dead. And we gather recognizing that we're waiting for that last chapter to be written. And yet even as we wait, we look around and we recognize, there's something afoot in this world beyond what we can see. And it has to do with you, and it has to be with me. And we look around us and we find that even as we wait for that last chapter to be written, God continues to write the story. And we find that, hey, you've been written into this thing. And I've been written into this thing. And we look around at each other, we say, well, how did that happen? But it did. And we're learning this way of tending to who God is and what God is up to in this world, even as we wait for what God will yet do. And it leads us to what Zechariah sings at the end of his song. He sings of two things, that this Jesus, this one who would come after John, what's going to happen through him. He says, here's this one who, we sang of this earlier too, this day spring. The morning sun is going to rise, and he's going to shine on those who live in the darkness, who live in the shadows of death, who know the terrifying things of life at times, and sometimes just how heavy life becomes. And what has become of some relations within humanity, within this world, people knowing what darkness is all about. Here comes one who finally has come to rise and to shine on those living in darkness. And then Zechariah sings, and he's come to guide our feet into this path of peace. Into the path of peace, that which we long for all to be made well. He's going to guide our feet so that we walk in this path. That's what we confessed earlier. Peace on earth. It's the announcement that's made. Sometimes we don't feel it. Maybe sometimes it's because we don't tend to it as fully as maybe we might. Maybe sometimes it's because our circumstances haven't changed in the way that we really want them to. So we need to say two things about this path of peace. The first one we'll say very briefly. The first is that there's this already and not yet component in terms of the feeling or the experience of this peace, where our minds are at ease. We know of something of this. There's something of a contentedness. There's something of a, I can wait, even in the midst of our most difficult circumstances. We heard Nancy report on this from Arlie. Joyce testifies to this too. Even in the midst of waiting, even in the midst of difficult circumstances, facing end of life, there's a remarkable peace there. It's present, but it's not full, because if it was going to be full, then the pain wouldn't just be over. The pain would be transformed. It would be fully made new. So we recognize that there's a peace that's already, but it's a foretaste. We're not there yet. So sometimes we wait patiently. We have to endure, even with a foretaste of that peace that we anticipate coming in full in time come. The other piece we need to consider, though, when Zechariah sings of this path of peace into which Jesus will guide our feet, that we may walk in this path, he has in mind a way of life, a way of being, a conduct. We remember the Psalm 23, the Good Shepherd. What's one of the things that the shepherd does? He guides us in paths of righteousness. Here goes the shepherd before us, reining us in, keeping us where we need to be, so that our lives conform to God's way for us, so that we might live in peace with one another in this world as we wait. This is what Zechariah is singing about. He's going to guide our feet into this path of peace, into this way of well-being in the widest sense, that we pursue that and we find it in our lives and we seek it for those with whom we are in relationship, for communities, and for communities far and wide. This is what Zechariah is singing about. Jesus is going to come, and he's going to guide our feet into this path of peace. So go back to this Jean-Pierre Guiterre for just a moment. Here's one of the interesting things about his time of waiting while he was in this refugee camp. Spent some 15-ish years or so in this one. Outside the camp, there's another community of people. These were native Kenyans. Remember, this refugee camp is in Kenya. Outside is a group of native Kenyans, but they, on the social scale, they rank below this community of refugees, meaning that while the refugees had very little, they were at least granted rations from the United Nations. This community of Kenyans on the outside, they were not. So here's what this gentleman did. He rallies the churches within the refugee camp. He says, we have rations. We've been given food. We've got the basics. And here's a community of people outside who have less than we do. How much do we have? If we gather all of our resources, all of our rations together, how much do we have? We're going to tithe this. and they took a portion of what they had received, and then they gave it to this community on the outside so that they would have some too. And here's one of the interesting things that happened. There had begun this network of churches within the refugee camp, and outside in this other community, there had been a small fledgling network of churches, and they were at tension with each other. And after this sharing, after this seeking of well-being, these communities began to become one in fellowship. Isn't that remarkable? Our feet get guided into this path of peace, and we find ourselves following the bringer of peace and seeking this well-being in the widest sense possible to the extent that we can. And I think that is by walking this path that we're certain that this peace that we wait for, this peace that seems to be so distant, so remote, sometimes, is it a possibility or not, we stay in this path and we find that, well, surely we're on the way. We don't know where it's going to end, how it's going to end, when it's going to end, but walking this path, we're sure that we're on the way to it, and we live with the awareness that Zechariah did, that the God who made promises, even if it's after a long wait, he's going to make good on them, and he's going to bring us there. So what else does this path of peace look like? We're going to do this very, very briefly. It's the season of list making. More particularly, it's the season of top 10 list making. So here's a list of 10 items. What does it look like for us to live in the path of peace, following Jesus, the one who came to bring peace? Headings, we're not going to go into detail on most of this, but it's a list. It's one list. It's a summary. But you'll see where it goes. 1, we worship. Here's where we come together as a community, and we hear God speak, addressing us as his people, saying, though it doesn't appear that I might be doing much in this world, this is what's happening, and this is where we're going. Listen, tune in, trust, believe. Focus on what you cannot see, because it's true, and I will bring you to where you want to go. 9, we're counting backwards. 9, we seek to understand. We had the Colossian Forum in here for 3 weeks this fall. The Colossian Forum has come up in a context where people find that it's so divisive. And one person says this, or one group says this, and the other person says the opposite. And it's just a seeking to persuade. How do I win the argument? And one of the things that the Colossian Forum advocates for, teaches, is to ask questions of understanding. Help me understand your position. Why do you think the way that you do? What is it that you most want out of this? How do we do that well? In contexts of division, conflict, where I might have that opposite opinion of somebody else, how do I slow down enough to ask that question? Tell me a little bit about why you think that way, or how you came to believe that. There's something in there that disarms maybe the other group or the other person. Maybe it lowers the temperature in the room just enough where we can have that conversation. 8, we say thank you. Simple enough. We say thanks to God. There's something about gratitude, right, that's at the heart of this path of peace, where we recognize the generosity of God to us and others to us, and we demonstrate that appreciation. 7, we notice the suffering of others. There was a little commentary recently. The CEO of Twitter was out in Myanmar on some spiritual retreat, soul-searching, seeking, and he became criticized, at least from one angle. He was criticized for this because while he was in Myanmar, even though there's been persecution of a people group there, he made no mention of this in his tweets, in his report of what he was learning and searching. And people said, how could you, somebody who gets word out, that's what your business is about. You get word out and you go to a place, you're on the ground in a land where there's been massive persecution, and all you talk about is what you're learning. You don't highlight what's been happening to this group of people. How could that be? And we say, yeah, we don't want to be criticized in kind like that. Something of walking the path of peace is seeing with Jesus as he sees, and the plight of others, the plight of those around us who are suffering. We notice that. And then 6, to the extent that we can, we work to alleviate the suffering of those around us. So that's the first 5. We worship, we seek to understand, we say thank you, we notice the suffering of others, we work to alleviate the suffering of others. It's the first 5, it's a summary. Here's the next 5. We practice hospitality. Who's lonely? Who needs connection? This is what God does for us through Jesus Christ. We on the outside are welcomed in through Jesus Christ. Who's the lonely? Who's in the outside? Who needs belonging? Who needs community? Who can we make room for and say, you're welcome here. Come over, join us. 4, we comfort the sorrowful. We named this already this morning. I was in Walgreens earlier this week. Somehow a conversation developed with another shopper. She mentioned in the first minute, a couple of times just in passing, her late husband. She's in her 50s maybe. I said, oh, I'm sorry, your husband died. Yeah, 5 years ago, but the holidays suck. Yep, I can appreciate that. So we talked just very, very briefly, and I probably didn't do as much as I could have to say more. But we're going to stumble upon people who are sorrowful, mourning. The gospel's the gospel of comfort. Strengthens us through the glad announcement of what God has done through Jesus Christ. Gives us the courage and the strength to face what we need to face. Who needs comforting around us? 3, we accept forgiveness. This is what Zechariah sings of. John is going to go and he's going to give people the knowledge of the forgiveness of sins through this one who would come after John. And that's for us. We considered this fall when we were thinking about the Heidelberg Catechism sometimes how hard it is to believe fully in the assurance of sins that we are forgiven. And whatever guilt lingers, whatever shame lingers from that, we're free from it. We accept that. That's part of walking this path. It's the gift that's been given to us. And one of the corollaries then is that if we need to, then we forgive. We're wronged sometimes, we're offended sometimes. And the path of peace is the path that seeks reconciliation. If I've been wronged, how do I not treat a person according to the way that I think their sins against me suggest that they should be treated? We let go of that. I try to have the honest, truthful conversation that seeks a way forward so that where there's discord, where there's conflict, there can be a bringing together and reconciled relationship. It's part of the path of peace. And the last one that we'll note this morning, we'll end on it, we get to spread a little cheer. Because the gospel's good news, and it's a glad announcement, and there's a sorrowful world, and we get to sing in the midst of it. We're waiting for this peace that is to come, and sometimes the wait feels like it's never going to end, and yet here is Jesus who's come to guide our feet into the path of peace, the path on which we're sure that we're heading in the right direction. And we've got all sorts of ways to practice this and to live it out together and to demonstrate to the world that there's a peace available even now. And it's really quite a joyful peace.